Okay, we're going to start. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Hope you had an incredible Rosh Hashanah and an easy fast. And for those who are still fasting, hope you have an easy continuation of the fast. Tonight, we have the privilege and honor of having with us our Rosh Bet Midrash, Rabbi Joseph Dweck, and we'll be going through the Halakhot of Yom Kippur to prepare us for that awesome day. Before we start, just a brief announcement. We are very excited in the Chabura to announce the launch of our new book, a book on Sukkot. We worked very hard on that, and we're very excited that it's out. We have essays from Chachamim of the past. We have essays from our teachers today and from many of our students. So you can find that on our website. You can purchase it on Amazon, and make sure to get your copy before the Moed. So we're very excited about that. For those who are listening who are not yet members, I highly recommend joining, becoming a member, and not only taking advantage of all of the content that we have for our members, but also to be able to support all our initiatives, our publishing house, and books like that we just came out with. So with that said, thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and the floor is yours, Chacham. You're on mute, sir.
Good evening. Give me one moment, please. One moment. Yes. Good. I want to add two things here. Thank you for your patience. Okay. All righty. Do that. Do that. All right. I hope everybody's well. It's been a tight period of time. I have to remember not to do classes on fast days. This is the second one I've done so far. But nonetheless, here we are doing the class on the fast after the fast day. I want to speak a little bit about the laws of Yom Kippur. What I'm going to do, I'm not going to go through a survey of the laws of Yom Kippur. There are two things that I'd like to kind of like delve deeper into with you in order to be able to kind of have a better understanding of how these things are wired and where these halakhot come from and the way that they kind of manifest in different opinions on them. But the crux of Yom Kippur really has to do with what we call the inuyim, right? The inuyim are the word inui literally means to deprive or deprivation. So the mitzvah of the Torah for Yom Kippur is that we have to deprive ourselves. It's not specific as to how it is that we are supposed to deprive ourselves. And we have Mesorah, Torah Sheba'al Peh, that says the inui is meant to be with, everybody agrees that eating and drinking is one of the deprivations, right? The question is, what about the other deprivations? Deprivations that we know that come to five. So there's eating and drinking. There is anointing using oils or creams on one's skin for pleasure. There's wearing leather shoes. There's marital relations. There is yeah, those are the things. And so the question is, one of the questions is, are those other things that are aside from eating and drinking prohibited from the Torah or not? And there are various aspects that we have, even with regards to some poskim, like Harambam, where some say that Harambam holds his deoraita, some say Harambam holds his rabbanan. It's not clear. But what I'd like to do is to be able to focus on those inyanim, mainly the ones that come from the Torah. And that is, or that everybody agrees at least, that come from the Torah. And that's the eating and drinking. And there are some very interesting things that has to do with the eating and drinking on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur. And the reason for that is because there's no explicit nature to how it is that Torah speaks to us about it. So what I'll do is we'll look first of all at the Pesukim. Right? We'll look at some of the Pesukim that speak about Yom Kippur. just so that we can orient ourselves as to how it is that the Torah speaks of this. So both of these Pesukim are in Sefer Vayikra, Perashat Emor. And the first is this. On the 10th of the 7th month, we know that the 7th month is Tishri because the first month is Nisan. On the 10th of that month, it's a Yom Kippurim. It is a day of atonement. Mikra Kodesh Yelachem. And it is to be called sacrosanct, right? It is set aside and special. And on that day, you are to deprive your souls on that day, right? Meaning what it is that when we say soul, right, we're not talking terribly spiritually over here. I mean, obviously a soul is spiritual, but what we're saying is that the things that give you life, so the things that give you life that you normally use to sustain your life, you withdraw, you inhibit. And also, you're to bring a korban on that day for Yom Kippur. So it says it very much in a nutshell. Later in the Pesukim, it's about 10 Pesukim later, a little less than 10 Pesukim later, it comes and repeats it, and it says, Shabbat Shabbaton hu lachem. Right? It is, when we say Shabbat Shabbaton, it's not clear what Shabbat Shabbaton is. Some people like to say that Shabbat Shabbaton is a big Shabbat, right? But it's not. Shabbaton is always small. Anything that ends with Vav Nun is always less, right? So we say, for example, we call the pupil of the eye Ishon. Why do we call the pupil of the eye Ishon, right? Ki Ishon bat ayin. We call the pupil of the eye Ishon because when you look in the eye, you see an Ish, but he's little, right? If you look at somebody's eye, you can see yourself in their eye, looking back at yourself. That's why we call it an Ishon. And anytime that we add that suffix, we're calling it something smaller, right? So like a dubon. Dubon is a baby bear, right? A little stuffed teddy bear is dubon. So Shabbat Shabbaton it's not Shabbat Kodesh, right? Because Shabbat, everybody thinks that Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the year. Yom Kippur is not the holiest day. Shabbat is the holiest day. Yom Kippur is less than Shabbat. And that's why the punishment of Yom Kippur is less than the punishment of Shabbat. The punishment of Yom Kippur, as we will see, the most severe punishment that a person can receive for transgressing Yom Kippur is karet. Karet is severe. There's no question about the fact that it's severe. But sekila is worse. Stoning is worse. And the penalty for being mehalel Shabbat is sekila. So it's much worse for people to be mehalel Shabbat than it is for people to be mehalel Yom Kippurim. But nonetheless, the common Jewish knowledge is that Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the year. And even people that drive on Yom Kippur that drive on Shabbat, don't drive on Yom Kippur. That's good. I don't want people to stop doing the things that they do. But nonetheless, Yom Kippur, it can't be disputed. It's a very, very high, holy day, as we say. So the Torah says, Shabbat Shabbaton hu lachem, ve'initem nafshotechem. Again, it says, right? It's just said a few Pesukim earlier. It says again, you are to deprive yourself. So the question that we have to have legally, because we're dealing tonight with legalities, and I'm not dealing with the legalities of Teshuvah for a change, which is what I usually deal with, the deprivation has to be defined legally. Because if we are going to understand what deprivation is, right, and be able to fulfill it, we need to be able to know what are the parameters of deprivation, right? I mean, it could be that I sit outside in the freezing cold, or I put myself into an ice bath for hours on end, and that's also no. There has to be a legal definition that the nation keeps. It's interesting because the Shomronim, the Samaritans, I think they're called, that are in Eretz Israel, that are basically a sect of Karaim, that they don't have Torah Sheba'al Peh that like we do, or rabbinic interpretation as we do. They keep Kippur because it says in Torah, right, that you're supposed to, but everybody does. Children 2 months old are fasting on Yom Kippur. They don't have a concept as to who's Ra'ui to fast, and what do we do, and what's the appropriate way to do it, and so on. So nonetheless, the Pasuk says, V'initem nafshotechem. But then it says something else over here, which is a little bit strange. And this part of this pasuk is really what I want to spend some time on tonight, because it's a very interesting pasuk, and it's good to be able to see how the Hachamim understand this pasuk. It says, "B'tish'a lachodesh ba'erev," on the 9th of the month at night. So that's interesting because just in the pasuk before, remember, it says Be'asor lachodesh, on the 10th of the month. But here it says on the 9th of the month at night. Well, what does that mean? The 9th of the month at night. How are we supposed to make that out? And then it says me'erev ad erev, right? From the night till the night, right? So it sounds like on the 9th at night till the following night. Tishbitu Shabbatechem, there should be this Shabbat. And the Shabbat here is talking about it in terms of the melacha with the inui, right? So we're supposed to refrain from doing melacha, and we're supposed to refrain from engaging in things that replenish our soul, right? We're supposed to keep from those things and deprive ourselves on Yom Kippur. So we have to understand, a little bit more about this because the pasuk is fairly cryptic. It's very strange that it should say Tisha Chodesh Ba'erev. I mean, we all know that anytime that it gives a date in the Torah, it doesn't do this with every single festival. Anytime that it gives a date in the Torah, we always know it's at sunset. We begin the day at the setting of the sun in Torah. So why here does it say B'Tisha Chodesh Ba'erev? Which is a bit confusing because we know that the 10th starts with sunset. So why would it call it the 9th and then say the 9th at night? Right, the 9th at night really should be the 8th, right? In other words, the end of the 8th day, which is at the sunset of the 8th, it turns into the 9th. But that's not necessarily what it sounds like the pasuk is saying. So there's a Gemara that has a limud on this, right? As to how it is that we're supposed to understand the law with regards to it. It's a very odd way of saying it. And when we have a pasuk that says things in odd ways, it's begging us to understand its implications, at least legally. And what is the law that it is meant to tell us? So let's have a look first at the Gemara. I'll take a look at the Gemara. I hope I have the Gemara over here. Did I forget to put the Gemara? Of course I forgot to put the Gemara. Anyway, it comes in twice. It comes in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, and it comes in Masechet Yoma. I brought it from Masechet Yoma, but it's essentially the same sugya, so we'll take a look at it over here. So it says there's a baraita, and the baraita says, "Ve'initem et nafshotechem b'tisha chodesh." Right? That's the pasuk we just read. You are to deprive yourselves on the 9th of the month, but of course the pasuk continues, says lachodesh ba'erev. But here they want to say, what does it mean? What is this 9th of the month business? Ba'erev of the 9th of the month is the 10th. So they want to understand what is that coming to bring out for us. So they ask, right? Well, could it mean when it says Tisha b'chodesh la'erev that really what it's saying is start fasting on the 9th itself? Maybe that's what it means. Well, Talmud lomar ba'erev. Oh, it can't be that because it says on the 9th at night. So so then it's if it's erev, then it should be when it gets dark. That's when we start. Talmud lomar b'tisha. No, but it brings you back to the tisha, right? So we have basically a contradiction. We have an oxymoron in the pasuk itself, which is talking about tisha ba'erev, and they're not the same. It's either tisha or it's erev, and if it's erev, then it's asiri, not tishi. So that's what the Gemara wants to deal with. So back to the Gemara. What do they do with this? They actually do two things with this, but let's have a look at the first. So it says, so no, when it says it's like, so what are we doing here? What is it trying to explain? So what they're saying is you should start the inui when it's still a little bit of daytime, just before the sun sets, or that's what we assume anyway, you should begin. And it tells us what? It's teaching us a concept here. It's teaching us something valuable over here in terms of adding what we call Tosefet Chol HaKodesh. What is Tosefet Chol HaKodesh? That we have to add from the mundane, or we have to add from the weekday onto the holy or onto the sanctified. And that you have to bring some bit of the mundane and add it on to the sanctified. And that's why it says it in this funny way, because it's not just the 9th and it's not just the night. It's a bit of the 9th into the night. And that's how they want us to read it. Now, fine. Well, that's Eni ele b'knisato. Well, that's explicit with regards to the opening of the day, right? The opening of the day is the 9th to the 10th. But what about the end of the day? What about the end of the 10th? Should I add some of the 11th onto the 10th as well, the way that I added the 9th onto the 10th as well, which is the core of Yom Kippur? How do we know that we're supposed to do this at the end? Because it connects the night to the next night. Because it says Ma'erev ad Erev. So if it were just to say, but Halakhot ba'erev, that I would learn only at the opening of the day, I'm supposed to add from the whole into the nighttime. But from the fact that it says Ma'erev ad Erev after that, then it's also extending that concept all the way to the next night, which is the night of the 11th, essentially, which is when the 10th ends. Yeah, okay, so look at again in terms of the pasuk. The pasuk comes in again, right? The Hachamim learn Tish'ah connected to Erev means that I have to add some of Tish'ah onto the Erev. Ma'erev ad Erev teaches me that I'm supposed to do that at the end as well because I connect this bit to the last night. Yeah, you follow? Right? That's how it is that the Gemara understands it. That's one learning. But then they ask a further question, and they say, well, it's a very nice point that there's this idea that you should add from some of the mundane onto the holy, and some of the, and on the end, you also add some of the mundane into the holy, and you extend it on either end. But all of that is only for Yom Kippur, right? I mean, this whole pasuk applies only to Yom Kippur. So the Gemara asks further, it says, Enli ela Yom Kippurim, Yamim Tovim Minai. How do I know that I should do this for any Yom Tov? Right? Because Yom Tov is also Kodesh. Talmud Lomar Tishbetu. So when it says Tishbetu Shabbatechem, it's a bit of a redundancy. Right? Just say Tishbetu Shabbatechem. So if it says Tishbetu, Eni Ela, so it says that includes the Yamim Tovim into this concept, right? That I should have some of the whole onto the Kodesh, and some of the whole on the Kodesh, both at the opening and the closing. And then it says, what about Shabbatot? It says, Talmud Lomar Shabbatechem. So it says, Tishbetu Shabbatechem. So it says Tishbetu and Shabbatechem. One is for Yom Tov, one is for Shabbat. So Haketzad, again, the Gemara says, Kol makom shenemar Shavut mosivim mechol al kodesh. Anytime that it says Shabbat or Shavut or any kind of nature like that with regards to the days, I should add from the whole onto the Kodesh because the Shavut extends it back to this pasuk of Kippur, which says Tishbetu Shabbatechem, which extends to any other Shabbat, which include Shabbat and Yom Tov, and I'm supposed to do this bit, right? The opening and closing add-ons. So that's a very interesting Gemara. So the question is, how does this manifest halachically? Because one could say that, I mean, it's nice that we're extending it all the way to Yom Tov and Shabbat and so on, but this whole thing, even in the pasuk over here, notice, there's something about this. See, this pasuk, it doesn't talk about melacha at all, does it? In other words, there's nothing here. Normally it would say, Kol melacha lo ta'asu, right? Lo ta'asu melacha, something about the melacha. Doesn't say anything. What is it talking about over here in terms of the Shabbat? Inui. Elsewhere it says you have to have it a Shabbat mishum melacha. But here it's talking about Inui specifically. So have a look at how Harambam understands this. Right? How does Harambam write this out in the Mishneh Torah? And by the way, I mean, it was advertised that this is Chacham Ovadia. This is Chacham Ovadia. Right? Chacham Ovadia wrote all this. I'm just speaking it out to you, but he writes this. He writes this all out. So Harambam writes over here in Mishneh Torah, Halakhot Shebitat Asor, which is essentially the laws of Yom Kippur. He says as follows. Kashem shishavut melacha bo ben bayom ben balayla. Right, earlier in Halakhot he said, look, the fact that it's asur to do work on Yom Kippur, and incidentally the halacha is, and this is important, that the isur of melacha on Yom Kippur is equivalent to Shabbat, not lafuke what, right? To delineate what, that it's not like other yamim tovim. Right, other Yamim Tovim, there's a heter of ochel nefesh that we're allowed to do. Yom Kippur is not allowed, right? Yom Kippur we don't allow, any melachot that we would normally allow on Yom Tov with ochel nefesh. So the way that the Mishnah says it, en ben Shabbat liyom Tov, right? There's no, en ben Shabbat liyom Kippurim. The only difference between Shabbat and Yom Kippurim is ze dono beskilav, ze dono bekaret. That if you go against Shabbat intentionally, your penalty is skila. If you go against Kippur intentionally, your penalty is karet, but there's no difference between the two in terms of their Yisuri. And that's what they learn from the fact that it's a Shabbat Shabbaton, right? The fact that it connects it to Shabbat. So Harambam says not only is the Isur of Melacha on Kippur in the daytime, it's also in the nighttime, right? Why does it have to go out of its way to say it? Because their Inuyim are spoken about interestingly that way. So Harambam says also the Melacha that starts from the nighttime and goes into the daytime. So he says in the same way that there's a Melacha, that's a Sur du Melacha, whether it's the day or the night of Yom Kippur, Kach Shevut Le'inui. So to their Inuyim, not just the Melacha, right? The Melacha is a Sur to light fire, it's a Sur to write, it's a Sur to carry, all of those kinds of things, right? Those things, it's not those things alone. Also the Shevut, notice how Harambam talks about it as a Shevut Le'inui. He talks about the Inui, the deprivation, as a Shevut, right? Lashon Shabbat, which is why back up in this pasuk, it's very important. It says, again, Shabbat Shabbaton v'initem. The Shabbat that the pasuk is talking about over here is not Melacha, it's Inui. So Rambam says, Ken kach Shevut Inui. So too, just as Melacha is a Shevut on Shabbat, on Yom Kippur, as it is on Shabbat, so too the Inui is a Shevut Bayom Balayla, both in the day and the night. And then he says, "V'tzarich leosif mechol al hakodesh b'chniseato b'siato shneimar v'initem shotechem b'tshah lachodesh ba'erev." He brings a pasuk from the Gemara, and he says you have to start the inuyim, which means you have to start not eating and not drinking from before the sun sets. Right? We'll see in a minute that there's no shi'ur for the tosefet. Right? In other words, the fact that I have to add from the whole onto the Kodesh, there's no amount of time that I have to do it, right? There's no minimum amount of time I have to do. I could do it a minute beforehand, right? But I have to do something. And Harambam brings the pasuk the Gemara brings, and he explains the pasuk, Kilomar, the pasuk saying, Tish'a b'chodesh la'erev, it's as if to say, Hatchil tsumu lita'anot me'erev tish'a samuch la'asiri. It's as if the pasuk is saying, start your tzom. Tzom is specifically not eating, right? There's a difference between tzom and ta'anit, right? A tzom is not eating and drinking. Ta'anit is deprivation. So he says specifically, don't eat. You start the tzom, and you're ulhi ta'anot and deprive from erev tish'a, which is just adjacent to the asiri, right? So just a bit of time on the 9th, connected to the 10th. And so too at the end of it, you have to do you pause in your deprivation a bit. From the 11th, which has already happened after sunset. Right? It's exactly the mood that we saw in the Gemara. Harambam just codified it in the Halacha. He restated it in the Halacha. Yeah. So this is interesting. Why is this interesting? Because it seems that Harambam holds from this Tosefet. He holds from this Tosefet, but it seems that he only holds from the Tosefet for what? For their Inui. Not for the Melacha. You notice? He says, Kishem sheshvut Melacha bayom balayla. The only connection that the Inui has to the Melacha is that you have to do Inui and Melacha both at night and during the day. But the Tosefet, he says, Tzarich leosif mechol hakodesh v'nitzov v'tzov v'initem shenemar v'tem shalotechem kelomar latzum ulhitanot. Doesn't say anything about the Melacha. According to Rambam, it seems that the only Tosefet mechol al hakodesh that's required is for the Ta'anit, not necessarily for the Melacha, which is counter for what we normally do or what we know, right? We know in general that we tend to add, even for Shabbat, like the Gemara continues. But it's interesting, he doesn't include that here. And even Maran, take a look how Maran writes in Shulchan Aruch with regards to the Inui. He says, "Ochlin umafsikin kodem ben hashemashot shetzarich leosif mechol al hakodesh." We stop before ben hashemashot. According to Maran, what's ben hashemashot? It's a whole issue, right? But nonetheless, Ben Hashemashot, we assume is just before sunset, right? Because Ben Hashemashot begins right after sunset, at the point of sunset. He says, Sarich leosif mechol kodesh, but notice how he says, Ochlin umafsikin. What is he talking about here, Ochlin umafsikin? He's talking about the eating. The eating has to be added, meaning the lack of eating. You stop eating just a bit before. And then he tells you explicitly, Tosefet ze en lo shi'ur. Right? This addition that we have to make with Chol Halakhot doesn't have a measurement. Elakodim ben Hashemashot shizmano elef, and so he gives you the whole point of ben Hashemashot, and he calculates it, whatever it is, a little bit before. So it's interesting. The Magid Mishneh, which you'll see Harambam, which you'll see Maran right in the Bet Yosef over here. The Magid Mishneh says that Harambam doesn't hold from Tosefet, except in this case, with regards to Ainui, and that's a deoraita, right? That's a mitzvah deoraita because it says it explicitly in the pasuk. So we'll take a look at what Maran writes in Bet Yosef. Notice, he says, Harambam beperekeh lo hizkir din Tosefet. Harambam doesn't mention Tosefet anywhere else except for right here with regards to the Ainui. V'chatav Harav Magid, that's the Hehe, right? Harav Magid is a Magid Mishneh, which is Perush on the Mishneh Torah. Katav Harav Magid Perek Av Nechot Shevitat Asor. The Ta'ama, why doesn't Harambam talk about it anywhere else? He only writes it out here. Mishum delet le Tosefet, Devar Torah. Ela le'ainu Yom HaKippurim levad. Why? Because Harambam doesn't hold the Tosefet as mitzvah deoraita, except for their inuyim of Yom Kippur. That's it. Why does Rira de Halakhot command Darish lekrayed drasha harina? Because he holds that whole dirasha on the pasuk, right? That we have with regards to ninth and night and so on and so forth is used for something else, which is a bit strange, right? But we'll see in a minute. I'll bring up the Gemara and Rosh Hashanah. We'll see that there's a whole other way of reading that pasuk, the ninth at night and the 10th and the Erev at the Erev. There's a whole other way of reading that pasuk according to Rabbi Akiva. This is the way that we just saw it in Masechet Yomah, as the Rabbi Ishmael reads the pasuk. So he learns it for the Tosefet and then for Shabbat and Yom Tov and all of this. But Rabbi Akiva reads it a different way because Rabbi Akiva learns Tosefet from Shemitah and Yoved. He learns the Tosefet from those pasukim, not from these pasukim. He learns these pasukim differently, which you'll see. So he says over here, okay, so he's quoting the Maran in the Bet Yosef, is quoting the Magid Mishneh. Why? Because he holds according to Rabbi Akiva. He says, Mashmali, so this is Maran speaking now, right? He says, Mashmali Dvar Torah shekatav lav davka mitbarabanan nami. He says, Nami, why? The Tosefet. It's not let Tosefet. He's saying that even according to the Torah, that he says, Dvar Torah, when I say that, it's lav davka. In other words, Maran is saying that even when he says Dvar Torah, it's not really true that it's Dvar Torah. Even with regards to Tosefet. He says he thinks it's the Rabbanan. And that he doesn't have Tosefet at all. Dimlo ken lo haya lashmito. Right? If that's not the case, then if he holds that it's the Rabbanan, then Harambam shouldn't have just left it out entirely. He should have said, okay, it's Deoraita, here's the Rabbanan there. Rabbeinu shishmi din Tosefet. He says Rabbeinu, right? Harambam, he completely left out the whole din of Tosefet in all of the other areas, in Shabbat and Yom Tov, and the Melachav of Kippur. He left it out. Nira desvira le Rambam de le Tosefet de Shabbat, right? But Tema Ma'ishavak Sevarat Rosh. So now you can say, well, how come he didn't bring in the Sevarat of the Rosh? So it's interesting because the Rif and the Rosh both hold that Tosefet is Deoraita for Melacha, for all the things, which is very strange, right? And Harambam doesn't hold like that at all. And that's why he says, he goes over here, he says for the Rosh, Svarat HaRosh, the Yitle Tosefet the Shabbat. He holds that there's a Tosefet on Shabbat. But, Divrei Harambam, En Tzarich Leosif Mechol HaKodesh. According to Harambam, there is no obligation to add from the mundane onto the Kodesh, or from the weekday onto the holy day, onto the holiday. Ela bi'isur achila bilvad, except for the inui of eating. avalo beisur melacha, but not with melacha. And then he says, veheve odea, but you should know, shedat harif ve'arosh, shedat harif ke'arosh, that the rif agrees with the rosh, that you have to be mosif for Shabbat and Yom Tov and melacha and so on. Which, imagine, how is Maran posek then? If you see that Harambam he holds that there's no tosefet for Shabbat and for Yom Tov and for Melacha, and he only holds that it's a din tosefet for Yom Kippur, but the Rosh and the Rif hold that it is a tosefet mideoraita. How do you think Maran's posek Shulchan Aruch? Normally, we would expect that he should be posek like the Rosh and the Rif against Harambam, because that's how it usually is. There's 2 out of 3, and he always says, I'm going to be posek like 2 out of the 3. Anyway, I brought you the Rif over here. We're not going to have to read through the whole Rif, but the Rif is explicitly saying over here that there's a din Torah of Tosefet. And that's here. It says, Anush karet al Tosefet. Okay? Okay? So here, Maran writes like this in Shulchan Aruch. He says, well, first of all, let me see. I brought you 2 Shulchan Aruch. Okay? So Maran writes over here, Yesh omrim, shetzarich leosif mechol al hakodesh, uzman tosefet zehu metehilat hashkiya she'en hashemesh niret al haaretz, azman ben hashemashot. So he says there's some people that say you need to add from chol al hakodesh. He writes it in Lashon Yesh omrim, okay? And he goes, what is that? You have to add from the time that the sun sets before ben hashemashot. And he gives you the time frame for that, which we don't have to get into the technicalities of it. Okay, and he says, "Ubilvad shiosif ezes man shiyeh." You have to add any amount of time, right? Vadayom, from vadayom, which is a time that it's absolutely day, right? It's before sunset, which is already safek. You have to add a little bit. Okay, that's what he says. But it's noticed that he says yesh omrim over here. So it's mashma that Maran holds that in general, because this is with regards to Shabbat. It's mashma that Maran holds like the Rif and the Rosh, that there's a requirement of Tosefet for all of the Yamim Tovim and Shabbatot, and he writes over here that you're supposed to. The reason why he says Yesh Omrim, I think, is because he has kavod for Harambam, right? And we'll see also, because he could have just said this is the halacha, Mosifim Mechol al Kodesh, like he does in normal times, but he has kavod for Harambam, and he writes over here in Shulchan Aruch with regards to Yom Kippur itself. Very interesting, not like the Rif and the Rosh. He says, look what he says. He says, Ochlin umafsikim kodem ben hashemashot, like I showed you before. He's only talking about here the achilah, and that there has to be a tosefet of achilah, and this is exactly like Harambam. And some people question why, some of the poskim question why Maran was posek like Harambam over here when he has the Rosh and the Rif that would include Melachav Yom Kippur on this tosefet as well. Okay. So, in the end of the day, we hold, right, Lahalacha, Chacham Ovadia is posek lahalacha, that Tosefet needs to be done not only for the Inuyim, but also for the Melacha on Yom Kippur, and that it also has to be done not only for Yom Kippur, but it also has to be done for Shabbat and Yom Tov. So that's how we're posek at the end of the day, and the reason mainly for that is because the Rov poskim, right, the majority of Rishonim, hold that the Tosefet has to happen. Not only does Tosefet have to happen, it has to happen in Mideoraita. They learned that this whole limud in the Pasuk, right, the limud that we saw in Masechet Yomah, that extends it all the way to Shabbat Yom Tov, that's Deoraita. It's mashma that Harambam doesn't hold that as Deoraita. He holds that at best is the Rabbanan, and that it only really applies to the Einuyim of Yom Kippur, but we're not Tosefet on that. Okay? So now there's another bit to this. I'm going to bring up the Gemara from Rosh Hashanah. Give me 1 second. Because I thought I put on the sheets. And lo and behold, I did not put them on the sheets. There's a whole other halacha that we learn. Okay. Right. Share the screen again. Wait. What do I do? Yeah. Okay, everybody can see? You can see? Okay. So there's a discussion going on over here as to what do we do with this pasuk about Kippur, right? The Tish'a b'chodesh la'erev me'erev ad erev pasuk. What do we do with the pasuk? So we saw in Masechet Yomah that they just brought the Baraita, but they didn't bring names. They just had a limud in the Baraita that this has to do with adding from Halakhot Kodesh. The truth of the matter is there's an argument between Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva as to what it is that we do with this pasuk. Rabbi Akiva holds from the idea of Tosefet, although doesn't extend it to everything, and he learns it with regards to Shemitah, right? He learns it from the time of Shemitah, the same way that the seventh year is Kodesh, like Shabbat is Kodesh, so there has to be additions to the beginning of the Shvi'it year and the end of the Shvi'it year, and that's up here where Rabbi Akiva deals with all of this. Rabbi Ishmael then comes and he says, I'll just read it through for you so you can see how it's presented in Rosh Hashanah, but we just read this in Yomah, right? He says as follows. Rabbi Ishmael says, Mosifim echol HaKodesh menale. How do we know at all, right? You know, there's a discussion of adding from Chol to Kodesh. How do we know that we're supposed to do this? Nafka lemeditanya. We learned it from a Baraita that says, which was the Baraita that we brought in Yomah, right? You're supposed to deprive yourselves on the ninth. On the ninth, no, it says ba'erev. So it can't be the ninth completely. Ba'erev, but it says ba'erev means only when it gets dark. Talmud Lomar b'tisha brings you back to tisha. So they pull both together and they say it's supposed to be kaitzad. You begin the deprivation while it's still daytime outside, and then mosif mechol kodesh, and you bring it adjacent to the time that night comes, and you start that way. I know that that's only the case with the opening. What about the closing of the day? Talmud Lamar right? Since it says we do it on that side, right? Just a review. Okay, so they bring this also Masechet Rosh Hashanah, not just Yomah. Then it continues, says, how do I know that Yom Kippur is not the only thing that we do this with? We do this with Shabbat as well. It says Tishbetu. How do I know that Yom Tov is included in this? Because it says Talmud Mar Shabbatechem. How do I do this? Anytime the Torah says Shabbat, whether it's Shabbat of Yom Tov, Shabbat, true, Mamash, Yom Kippur, whatever it is, Rosh Hashanah, that has to be Tosefet Kodesh. But then the Gemara asks, says, since Rabbi Akiva learns this whole idea of Tosefet from Shemitah, what does he do with these Pesukim? This whole Tisha B'Chodesh La'erev business. He doesn't need those Pesukim for Tosefet. He already learns Tosefet back from Shemitah. So what does he do with these Pesukim? He learns a whole other deen from these Pesukim. And what is the deen that he learns from these Pesukim? Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Akiva, what does he do with these Pesukim? Gemara says, he does what Rav Hayam Difti does, which is what? They read it differently. Say, you are to deprive yourselves on the ninth. Ask the Gemara, we deprive ourselves on the ninth? The 10th is the time that we deprive ourselves. Everybody knows that the 10th, right? Because remember, there was the other pasuk that says explicitly, says explicitly, what is it then telling you? A curveball they throw over here. They say that anybody who eats and drinks on the ninth is considered like they fasted for 2 days, both the ninth and the 10th. If you eat and drink on the 9th and fast on the 10th, it's as if you fasted the 9th and 10th. Okay, it's very interesting. That's their reading. They don't. They pull that out of a hat, right? That all of a sudden, this adding on the 9th, since we know that the 10th is the day of deprivation, and yet they add the 9th, then they're basically saying we're going to add the 9th onto this whole thing. We're tacking the 9th onto the whole thing. Now, of course, the 9th is not a day of deprivation. Since it's not a day of deprivation, I know that I can eat and drink on that day. I'm not supposed to fast on that day, but I'll tag it on. And if you do, then we look at it as though these 2 days are connected. And what you do on the 9th is connected to what you do on the 10th. You eat and drink on the 9th, you fast on the 10th. Both days are holy, and they're considered as a full unit. And that's how you're supposed to do. That's the learning of Rabbi Akiva. And from this, we learn that you're not allowed to fast on the 9th. Not allowed to fast on the 9th of Tishri. And Maran holds the halakha, that that's what you're supposed to do. You're not allowed to fast on the 9th. You'll see. Okay, we can bring it up, I believe. Gotta move my things around because everything's covered. Okay, that's funny. Okay. So have a look at the Shulchan Aruch. This he doesn't bring here. Look. I showed you, I have it on the page. I think I have it on the page anyway. Let me pull it up for you. Okay. Okay, have a look. Okay. So Shulchan Aruch Tafresh Daled. Mitzvah lechol ba'erev Yom Kippurim l'harbot b'seudah, Maran says. There is a mitzvah to eat on Yom Kippur and to be plentiful with seudah, right? To have a lot of meals and eating throughout. Where does he get this from? He gets this from that Gemara that we just saw. Posek like Rabbi Akiva. And that truthfully is the halakha. That's how Chacham Ovadia is posek, that we're not allowed to fast on the day. And not only are we not allowed to fast, we should eat. We should spend the day eating on the 9th. So there's more to this, which I think is very interesting. Let's have a look at it. Harambam he's not posek that at all. Harambam doesn't bring this idea that you're not allowed to fast or that you have to eat on the 9th. You would think that he would bring it in the laws of Yom Kippur, just like everything else, right? Doesn't bring it at all in the laws of Yom Kippur. So some people want to say that Harambam doesn't hold from the holy mood in the Gemara of Rabbi Akiva. Except that the Magid Mishneh, interestingly, says, no, Harambam holds like Rabbi Akiva Mehavero, that when there's an argument between Rabbi Akiva and another Tana, another of his contemporaries, the halakha is like Rabbi Akiva. Well, it's very nice to say that, but we don't say that Rabbi Akiva's halakha is nifsak, is established in Harambam's book. Says the Magid Mishneh. But we do see that it is established. And we see that it's established in a very, very interesting way. Where is it? He says it's over here. Okay. It's in Halakhot Nedarim, which is the laws of vows, which is a bit interesting when it comes to Yom Kippur, because Yom Kippur has everything to do with vows, right? We still open the day with Kol Nidre, which is all Nidarim, right? Kol Nidre, right? It has to do with that whole bit. And we have this whole Hataran Nidarim that we try to do ahead of time. Very interesting. But nonetheless, Harambam has the laws of vows. And one of the things that he's talking about over here is if I make a vow to fast, but the day on which I vow to fast is a day that I'm not supposed to fast. So what do? Does the vow take precedent, or does the day itself that requires me to eat take precedent, right? In other words, if I vow to not eat, does that trump the fact that I'm supposed to eat on a particular day? So let's have a look. Hanoder shiatzum b'Shabbat, let's say. Person makes a vow, I'm going to fast on the 10th of September, whatever the case is, right? And it ends up the 10th of September is a Shabbat. He didn't pay attention, but he said the thing, now he realizes the date that he established is it's Shabbat. Or it's a Yom Tov. So what takes precedent? The Shabbat and Yom Tov that you're supposed to eat, or your vow that you're going to fast? He says, Hayav Latzum, your vow. If you made a vow, then you have to fast. Why? Because a neder falls and takes hold on things that are otherwise mitzvah. What does it mean, mitzvah? Shabbat, there's not an obligation to eat. It's a mitzvah to eat, which means it's a positive thing that you should do, right? And so therefore the neder takes hold on it. V'chen, and so too, hanoder shiatzum yom rishon yom shlishi kol yamav. If a person makes a neder and said, I'm gonna fast every Sunday for the rest of my life. I'm going to fast every Tuesday for the rest of my life. And all of a sudden, or not all of a sudden, but it happens to be that a Sunday or the Tuesday falls out on a Yom Tov or an Erev Kippur. Oh, an Erev Kippur. Yeah, look what he says. He says, and you say, I'm not going to fast on Sundays or Tuesdays. And all of a sudden, the Sunday or the Tuesday comes out, and it's either a Yom Tov or Erev Yom Kippurim. Well, that's very strange. What would be the problem with Erev Yom Kippurim? The 9th of the month. Harei zeh hayav latzum. Well, in that case, you have to fast. Ve'en tzarich lomar Rosh Chodesh, and all the more so Rosh Chodesh, because Rosh Chodesh is less heavy than apparently Yom Tov and Erev Yom Kippur. Well, what do you think the Magid Mishneh wants to do with this halakha? What he wants to do with this halakha is say, it's quite clear that from the very fact that Harambam is bringing up this issue that a neder would take hold on Erev Yom Kippur. What's the chidush? I mean, obviously Erev Yom Kippur. Who cares? So it's Erev Yom Kippur. Nobody said anything about having to fast, eat or not. No, obviously you're supposed to eat on Erev Yom Kippur. There's a prohibition to fast on Erev Yom Kippur. Where would Harambam have gotten? Of course, he got it from the Gemara. But it's interesting because here he says it's mitzvah, not chovah. Right? Because remember, over here he says, right? Al divrei mitzvah kemo shebi'arnu. So he's saying he's holding here, says the Magid Mishneh. In all honesty, I think the Magid Mishneh has, not that he needs me to say, but it's a very strong point. Because otherwise, it makes absolutely no sense to throw. Listen, look at where he's putting this Erev Yom Kippur. He's putting it together with Shabbat and Yom Tov. And I'll show you, because look at the rest of the halakha. Meaning it's so important to eat on the 9th, right? Erev Yom Kippur, he connects it as equivalent to Shabbat and Yom Tov, as opposed to what? As opposed to Purim and Hanukkah. Purim and Hanukkah are lower than Erev Kippur. Fascinating. All right, so he says over here like this. Paga bo Hanukkah Purim yidahe nidro. This is also a very interesting halachic function over here, because he says if a person made a neder to fast, but the fast fell out on Purim or Hanukkah, you're not allowed to fast. Hanukkah and Purim takes precedence. That's crazy. I mean, you think ostensibly it doesn't really make any sense. Why? Because Shabbat and Yom Tov, you're going to tell me that I should fast anyway when I made the neder, but on Hanukkah and Purim, which are rabbinic holidays in and of themselves, I should eat instead of fasting? He says yes, and listen to the reason why. He says, why? Because these days are entirely rabbinic days. And the prohibition of fasting, notice what he says, the prohibition of fasting on these days is also rabbinic. Which implies what? Which implies that the prohibition of fasting on Shabbat and Yom Tov and Erev Yom Kippur, mind you, is deoraita. Because these are rabbinic. So if they're rabbinic, shouldn't they be more lenient? And if you fast on Shabbat, shouldn't you all the more so fast on Hanukkah and Purim? No, says Harambam. And Rambam's only restating what's in the Gemara. Says why? Because they're entirely rabbinic, says the Rambam. They're weak. W-E-A-K. And they need chizuk. And if we allow people to make nidarim not to eat on Hanukkah and Purim, it'll just destroy Hanukkah and Purim. Shabbat and Yom Tov not so easily destroyed. Hanukkah and Purim, because they are so weak even in their foundations. What does it mean so weak? Meaning they're not from there's no pisukim in the Torah that talk about them. I mean, no matter what you do, you read the Torah, and the Torah says you have to keep Shabbat, and the Torah says you have to keep Yamim Tovim. You know, how and what, but it's there, black on white, on the parchment, ink. It's clear. You have to do them. So they're strong. They're established by Pisukim. These are not established by Pisukim. And once we start making issues with them, where a person makes a neder and all of a sudden he doesn't eat Seudat Purim, or he doesn't eat the Hanukkah, jam donuts, it's going to throw the whole Hanukkah out the window. So no, your fast doesn't work. You have to eat anyway on Purim and Hanukkah. But what we learn from this also is that Hanukkah and Purim are rabbinic, as opposed to what? As opposed to Erev Yom Kippurim, which is included with Shabbat and Yom Tov. And that's in Harambam. So the Magid Mishneh says, from here we see that Harambam holds that Achila on Erev Yom Kippur it's likely deoraita. And you have to eat. You're not allowed to fast on that day. And so Maran writes also, he says, mitzvah, right? Again, it says, mitzvah le'echol be'arev Yom Kippurim bod b'ser oda. There's a mitzvah to eat on Erev Yom Kippur and to have, meals and so on Erev Yom Kippur. And that comes from the Gemara that we just saw in Rosh Hashanah that says that if you do both, you eat on the 9th and fast on the 10th, it's as if both days are considered holy in their own way with their own avodah, one with eating, one without eating. And it's as if you did both in full holiness. So Hacham Ovadia is posek that we have to eat on the 9th. So he recommends that people, take snacks with you and stuff on the 9th, wherever you are. Don't forget to eat on the day so that you treat the day appropriately. And aside from that, I just wanted to go into those points with you. Otherwise, everybody knows, I think, that, that they're Inuyim. And then the only questions that come to me always on Yom Kippur or before Yom Kippur is, my wife is pregnant. Does she have to fast? She just had a baby. Does she have to fast? I'm sick. Do I have to fast? I'm not feeling well. Do I have to fast? And all of those questions, I prefer to answer privately rather than publicly as a blanket statement. So if anybody has any questions, you certainly can message me, and I'm happy to respond with regards to your specific case, because the cases usually are specific. And with that, we will close. And if there are any questions, I will do my best to answer. Where are we? Thank you so much for joining us. That's not a question. Wouldn't be the Rosh Posek like the Riv considering? Yes, obviously. Okay. If you are not supposed to fast on the 9th, is that why some have the custom of having a morning seudah before the meal? I don't know of that custom. Please, can we get it? But perhaps. Please, can we get a link to the source sheet? Get a link to the source sheet. Put it here. It's already at the end of the shir. Nonetheless, there you are. All right. I wish everybody Gamar Chatima Tova, Tizkur Shalim Rabot, Naimot V'Tovot, and thank you for joining me. And there you are.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Chacham, for your time. And everyone have a great night.